School of our Divine Infinite Being, Central Doctrine.
Iamblichus's Opposition to Sorcery, Christian Demons versus Neoplatonic Daemons, the Rise of Goetic Grimoires in Medieval and Renaissance Europe. This chapter holds great importance for a variety of reasons. One notable aspect is its relevance to my brothers and sisters deeply immersed in the lore of ceremonial magic. For those less familiar with this tradition, the material remains highly educational. Let me begin by saying that I personally have a deep love for the spiritual and transcendent artwork, rituals, and archetypes of the eternal spirit found in both the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox religious movements. They stand as pillars of spiritual rootedness, giving us the ability to see deep into the ancient past. Although I cover this in other chapters, their highest intentions align with those of a perennial theurgist, as understood from the perspective we hold at the school of our Divine Infinite Being. Our acceptance of them is not mirrored by their acceptance of our faith and practices, but we strive to take the higher ground, knowing that the infinite resides within all that strives towards goodness and the light. We are practitioners of Theurgy, a spiritual discipline developed around the divine intelligences of the celestial realms, the gods, goddesses, and demonic spirits, these vast agencies of form and archetype that serve the creator of the universe, the Platonic Demiurgos. This divine administration flows through the cosmic soul, embodied by Hecate as the anima mundi, pluralistic and pregnant with the cosmos. Our practices deeply incorporate the gods and goddesses of the Hindu East, as well as those of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, particularly through the sacred arts of astrology and tarot. Although these divine figures are central manifestations of the One, our Divine Infinite Being, every version of our divine relationship would categorically be deemed demonic by much of the greater Christian population today. In this chapter, we aim to take you on a journey of transformation, further educating you on how the demon-haunted world envisioned by certain traditions is far removed from the true origins of these concepts in Neoplatonism, and how you may discern the difference for yourself. What we speak of here is simply a historical record of events and in no way an attempt to overturn 2,000 years of Christianity. There is much good to be said of the Judeo-Christian West, but there are also shadows, many sinister at that. The following illumination is simply a necessary one for those considering a spiritual path similar to our own. Firstly, it is critical to understand the separation of sorcery and theurgy. To fully emphasize the distinctions between Iamblichean theurgy and practices like sorcery or goetia, we must delve deeper into the philosophical, ethical, and practical frameworks. This difference is not merely semantic or theoretical, but reflects an outright opposition in intent, method, and spiritual outcome. Theurgy represents a path of spiritual ascent, grounded in divine harmony and ethical purity, while sorcery epitomizes a disruptive, coercive manipulation of spiritual forces. These practices are not only different in degree, but fundamentally irreconcilable in nature. Iamblichus, as you know, is considered the father of our school and a seminal figure in the Neoplatonic tradition. He regarded theurgy as a sacred science, its purpose being to align the practitioner's soul with the divine by cultivating a life of spiritual receptivity, reverence, and harmony. As Crystal Addey notes,
Iamblichus is adamant that there are substantial differences between theurgy and magic. He firmly differentiates them according to several key criteria. 1. The way of life and receptivity of the ritual practitioner. 2. The use of symbols according to divine love and sympathy, the method of the theurgist, or according to sympathy only, the magician and the consequent metaphysical realms with which the symbols are connected. And 3. The extent to which the ritual practitioner sees his capacities to use ritual power as his own, the magician, or as a gift of the gods, the theurgist. These criteria were envisaged as connected, for Iamblichus certainly implies that the way in which the symbols are used and the attitude of the ritual practitioner are inextricably linked with their way of life and consequent receptivity.
this distinction is critical. Theurgy requires a turning upward of the soul towards the divine, a posture of humility and grace that allows divine illumination to flow through the practitioner. The Theurgy symbols and invocations serve as bridges to divine realms, fostering harmony and a profound sense of divine participation. In contrast, sorcery, whether in the form of goetia or other magical traditions, seeks to impose the practitioner's will upon spiritual forces, often through manipulation and deceit. Sorcery, and particularly goetia, operates within a fundamentally different metaphysical and ethical framework. Rather than aligning with the divine order, sorcery seeks to exploit spiritual forces for personal gain or malice. Goetia often involves the summoning, binding, and commanding of spirits, including demons, through coercive rituals. These practices are not only manipulative, but dangerous, as they expose the practitioner to malevolent influences and disrupt the harmony of the spiritual cosmos. Addey elaborated on this contrast.
The former magic employs falsehood and deceit, producing a certain motion of the soul which draws a phantom-like appearance, likely to be disturbed by evil daemons. While Theurgy connects its practitioners with the gods, this quality ensures that theurgic operations are inaccessible to and unobstructed by evil daemons, because the presence of divine illumination blocks anything of a contrary nature.
Theurgy's reliance on divine illumination ensures that its rituals remain untainted by malevolent forces. This is because the presence of divine light inherently dispels and protects against anything contrary to its nature. Sorcery, by contrast, invites spiritual disorder and imbalance, drawing upon lower forces that disturb both the practitioner and the metaphysical environment. Ancient curse tables, defictiones, and rituals for harm exemplify the stark contrast between sorcery and theurgy. These tablets, inscribed with curses or invocations, were designed to harm or control others, often calling upon chthonic underworld spirits to aid in such a quest. The curse tables of Athens, found in graves or wells, often sought to bind the actions or wills of rivals, whether in legal disputes, love affairs, or business. Many Roman-era tablets invoke chthonic deities such as Hecate or Pluto, asking for the misfortune or destruction of enemies. Many Egyptian rituals use symbols and effigies to manipulate individuals or events, reflecting the sorcerer's attempt to dominate the spiritual and material realms. These practices, while superficially similar to theurgic rituals in their use of invocations and symbols, lack any connection to divine order or harmony. Instead, they reflect an egocentric and often malicious intent, further underscoring their incompatibility with theurgy. Iamblichus firmly rejected any suggestion that theurgy could be equated with sorcery. Theurgy for him was the act of divine grace rather than the human manipulation. As Addey writes,
The way in which the symbols are used, and the attitude of the ritual practitioner, are inextricably linked with their way of life and consequent receptivity.
The theurgist does not claim ownership of ritual power, but acknowledges it as a gift from the gods. This humility ensures that theurgic practices remain aligned with divine love and sympathy, fostering spiritual ascent rather than descent into chaos. Theurgy and sorcery are diametrically opposed practices. Theurgy embodies a path of divine harmony, humility, and spiritual ascent, connecting the practitioner with the gods. Sorcery, in contrast, represents a path of coercion, manipulation, and spiritual imbalance. While both may use symbols and invocations, their intent, methods, and outcomes place them in entirely separate realms, as Iamblichus adamantly affirmed. Our school, dedicated to the understanding of our divine infinite being, neither condones nor engages in any form of sorcery or goetia, and we hope you will come to understand and agree with our reasoning. This perspective marks a significant departure from even some of my closest friends. I am deeply concerned whenever I see them practicing goetia, not because I perceive it as inherently evil, but because, in truth, it is ineffective, futile, and has often led to damaging personal relationships with the true vast agency of demonic spirits. As stated earlier by Shaw, the Church turned the Neoplatonic Daemons into demons, but it wasn't just this alone. The Christian concept of malevolent demons is deeply rooted in Hebrew traditions, where evil spiritual beings were thought to influence human lives and oppose divine will. In Hebrew belief, the term often used is Shediim, which refers to spirits or entities considered less powerful than God, but capable of exerting harmful influence. The Hebrew Bible, particularly in texts like Deuteronomy 32:17 and Psalms 106:37, mentions these beings in the context of idol worship, suggesting that polytheistic gods might actually be malevolent spirits misleading humanity. This connection between idolatry and malevolent forces laid the groundwork for demonology in Christian theology and their later attacks on Greek religions. In the Second Temple period, between 500 BCE and 700 CE, Jewish thought began to develop a more elaborate demonology influenced by cultural exchanges with neighboring regions, including Babylonian, Persian, and Hellenistic beliefs. Texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, which are part of the broader Jewish Apocrypha, describe fallen angels who rebelled against God and became demons. For instance, the Book of Enoch expands on the Genesis 6:1-4 account of the sons of God, interpreted as angels, who mated with human women and fathered the Nephilim. These angels were subsequently cast out of heaven, becoming wandering spirits associated with corruption and sin. Such narratives were highly influential and became foundational to Christian ideas about demonic origins. When Christianity emerged, it inherited Jewish ideas about demons but reframed them within its own theological framework. The New Testament frequently mentions demons, particularly in the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus is depicted as exorcising demonic entities that cause physical and material afflictions. For example, in Matthew 12:24, the Pharisees accuse Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, a name linked to Baal worship in the Hebrew tradition and later interpreted as a demonic figure in Christian demonology. The Greek word daemonian, used in the New Testament to refer to demons, reflects an adaptation of Hellenistic terminology. However, the Greeks themselves had vastly different definitions of daemons, which were unrelated to the Hebrew understanding of malevolent spirits. Thus, Christian demonology can be seen as an evolution of Hebrew belief about spirits, expanded and reshaped through the lens of early Christian theology. The integration of these ideas provided a cosmological explanation for evil and spiritual warfare, reinforcing the dichotomy between God and Satan. Over time, Christian theology further developed its demonology, incorporating elements of medieval and early modern European folklore. However, its roots in the Hebrew understanding of malevolent spirits remain foundational. Christianity's interaction with Greek philosophy significantly shaped its early theology, but it also profoundly altered early Greek concepts, particularly regarding daemons. For many scholars, the Christian world represented a meeting of Athens and Jerusalem, exemplified by the syncretic attitudes seen in Alexandrian Egypt. There, thinkers like Philo, the Hebrew Middle Platonist, profoundly influenced Christian doctrine and culture. Scholars have extensively examined the influence of Stoic and Platonic philosophies on early Christian thought. In Stoicism in early Christianity, editors Thomas, Rasimus, Troels, Enberg, Peterson, and Ismo Gunderberg argue that early Christians were more often influenced by Stoicism than by Platonism, while acknowledging that Platonism also had a significant philosophical impact. Similarly, in The Influence of Philosophy in Early Christianity, Karol Korek explores how early Christian thinkers integrated philosophical concepts into their teachings, noting that scholars can find traces of the influence of Stoicism in Pauline ethics, particularly in St. Paul's letters to the Philippians and Galatians. Furthermore, W.R. Inge, in The Permanent Influence of Neoplatonism upon Christianity, states that hardly a single Greek philosopher was wholly uninfluenced by Neoplatonism, which subsequently impacted Christian thought. In Greek thought, particularly in the works of philosophers like Plato and the Stoics, daemons were not malevolent entities, but intermediaries between the divine and human realms. Plato describes daemons as spiritual beings facilitating divine communication, while the Stoics saw them as rational and often protective forces. These interpretations emphasized their neutral or even benevolent nature, predating the Christian reinterpretation in ancient Greek culture by approximately 700 years. However, when Christianity adopted the term daemonian, it repurposed the concept to align with its dualistic worldview, conflating these spiritual beings with the malevolent spirits described in Hebrew traditions. Pythagoreans regarded daemons as semi-divine beings, aiding the soul's journey towards enlightenment and harmony within the cosmic order. Similarly, religions like the Eleusinian Mysteries reference daemons in their teachings, treating them as spiritual guides within sacred rites. Building on Greek Stoicism, Roman Stoics like Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius adopted the idea of Daemons as personal spirits, manifestations of divine will, or guiding principles within the cosmos, associated with divine reason, logos. Neoplatonists such as Plotinus and Porphyry expanded on Plato's ideas, describing Daemons as intermediaries in the metaphysical hierarchy, aiding the soul's ascent to the divine. The Roman concept of lares, household spirits, and genii, personal guiding spirits, closely paralleled the Greek Daemons as protective or guiding entities. Additionally, Hermeticism, a synchristic Platonic tradition influenced by Egyptian and Greek thought, incorporated Daemons as spiritual beings, aiding in divine knowledge and self-realization. Mithraism, a Roman mystery religion adopting Hellenistic ideas, also featured beings akin to Daemons, acting as intermediaries in a layered spiritual cosmology. Christianity's redefinition of Daemons marked a stark departure from the original Greek meaning, which lacked the sinister connotations imposed by Christian theology. By framing Daemons as agents of Satan, Christianity polluted the Greek understanding with a moral binary foreign to its origins. The result was a hybrid cosmology in which Hebrew demonology and Greek metaphysics coalesced, but in a manner that distorted the latter's more nuanced view of spiritual hierarchies. This synthesis illustrates how Christianity incorporated elements of Greek philosophy, particularly its metaphysical and ethical frameworks, while reshaping its inheritance. In doing so, it transformed how subsequent Western cultures would perceive the nature of spiritual forces. The openly aggressive appropriation of Hellenistic definition of daemons into malevolent demons began with early church apologists. These figures used propaganda and written apologetic works to wage a cultural war against the Greek-influenced polytheistic practices of non-Christian faiths, discrediting centuries-old cultural beliefs across the Greco-Roman world. The efforts of these church fathers and their followers facilitated the rise of political imperialism, which ultimately dominated the Christian landscape during the Roman Catholic era. Several notable examples illustrate this transition.
But those who hand down the myths which the poets have made adduce no proof to the youths who learn them, and we proceed to demonstrate that they have been uttered by the influence of wicked demons to deceive and lead astray the human race. Justin Martyr, Christian Apologist, 1165 CE, Apology, chapter 22/23. All the gods of the nations are demons. They are unclean spirits, the ruin of the human race, working to draw men away from the truth by superstition and idolatry. The beings whom you call gods are not only demons, but the most immoral of demons, delighting in the impurities of sacrifices and the blood of victims. Tertullian, Christian Apologist, 160-220 CE, Apology, chapter 22/23. The poets and philosophers, while they sought to spread abroad the glory of their gods, were not aware that they were praising demons. For the demons, being crafty, obscure their vices by their names, that they may more easily deceive men. It is clear that those whom the people worship as gods are nothing else than wicked spirits, who thirst after human blood and delight in the slaughter of wretched men. Lactantius, Christian Apologist, 252-325 CE, The Divine Institutes, Book 2, Chapter 14/15. These unclean spirits who are called demons rejoice in deceiving those whom they subjugate, and subject to themselves by the false notion of being gods, and to whom they promise protection but really keep in subjection. The gods of the pagans are demons. What are these gods of the nations but demons, swollen with pride, impure and deceitful, malicious and envious? Augustine of Hippo, Christian Apologist, The City of God, Book 9, Chapter 23/35. Those who are called gods by the Greeks are demons, malicious beings who delight in the ruin of men. It is they who have inspired the impious myths of Homer and Hesiod, leading men away from the true knowledge of God. To me, therefore, that Thracian Orpheus, that Theban, and that Methymenian men, and yet unworthy of the name, seem to have been deceivers, who, under the pretense of poetry corrupting human life, possessed by a spirit of artful sorcery for purposes of destruction. For your revered Orpheus, after composing the mysteries, the secret rites, and the symbols of his theology, perished by a Thracian woman's hand, according to the account of his end. But our Orpheus, the Word of God, the composer of the true song, is uncreated and eternal. Clement of Alexandria, 150 to 115 CE. Exhortation to the Greeks. Chapter 1/2.
In Orphism and Christianity in late antiquity, Miguel Herrero de Jargui explores the deliberate strategies employed by early Christian apologists to discredit and suppress Greek religious traditions. One of the most striking observations in his work is the systematic use of fabricated narratives by Christian writers to undermine the legitimacy of Greek religion. These efforts, Herrero argues, were not merely incidental, but a purposeful attempt to establish Christianity's intellectual and spiritual dominance. For instance, Clement of Alexandria, in his Protopisus, Extortion of the Greeks, not only criticizes Greek deities, but recasts their origin as either deified mortals or malicious demons. Clement frames Orphic theogonies as grotesque myths meant to deceive humanity, despite Orphism's focus on cosmic order and divine mysteries. By accusing Greek religion of moral corruption and absurdity, Clement systematically undermines its philosophical depth and sacred meaning. Herrero highlights how such critiques often relied on exaggerations or outright distortions of Greek beliefs, portraying them as morally reprehensible and spiritually bankrupt. Similarly, Eusebius of Caesarea, in his Praeportata Evangelica, Preparation for the Gospel, claims that Orphic theogonies are derivative and corrupted versions of Hebrew Scripture, attempting to position Christianity as the rightful heir to ancient wisdom. This reinterpretation not only delegitimized Greek religious traditions, but also rewrote their narratives to serve the Christian theological framework. Herrero notes that Eusebius frequently employed misrepresented texts and selective quotations to construct a narrative that casts Greek religious views as inferior or misguided. Herrero emphasizes that the apologists' most effective weapon against Greek religion was their capacity to fabricate and propagate lies that reframe Greek gods as either powerless abstractions or active agents of evil. These lies included claims that Greek gods demanded immoral acts, fostered chaos, or were figments of human imagination designed to enslave the human spirit. Such fabrications were central to the Christian polemic, as they not only discredited Greek religious practices but also cast the Christian God as a superior and singular alternative. In Herrero's analysis, this campaign of disinformation had far-reaching effects. By redefining Greek religion through the lens of moral and spiritual deficiency, Christian apologists created a cultural climate where Greek religious practices could be more easily dismissed, suppressed, or outlawed. This strategic use of lies and distortions ensured that the rich symbolic and philosophical framework of the Greek religion were increasingly seen as dangerous or irrelevant, paving the way for Christianity's rise as the dominant spiritual paradigm in late antiquity. Through these examples, Herrero clearly demonstrates how the deliberate manipulation of Greek religious narratives was not only a tool of suppression, but also a means of cultural conquest. The apologists' reliance on fabrications illustrates the length to which early Christian writers would go to dismantle competing worldviews and solidify their own theological authority. This strategy laid the foundation for the later dominance of Roman Christianity, shaping the attitudes and policies of subsequent religious movements as they sought to centralize power and eliminate alternative spiritual traditions. These lies about the ancient religious practices of the polytheistic world twisted into demonic and grotesque imaginings that lasted into the medieval period, the very period where we see the rise of the goetia and the distorted practices of demonic ceremonial rites. Sorcery, or goetia as Shaw identifies it, survived as a fragmented and often misunderstood underground practice, severed from the comprehensive spiritual framework of Neoplatonic theurgy. Unlike the profound cosmological and metaphysical context that gave meaning to theurgy, the books of demonology that emerged within the early Catholic period were distorted remnants of what had once been a sacred practice of divine engagement. Manuscripts like the Hygromantia and later Solomonic texts though claiming to offer esoteric knowledge, were impoverished imitations of the genuine spiritual path envisioned by the Neoplatonists. These texts reduce the complex relationships between humanity, Daemons, and the divine into mechanistic rituals of summoning and binding spirits, catering to a worldview dominated by fear and control rather than enlightenment and harmony. Far from preserving the integrity of ancient wisdom, these demonological works reflected the Church's anxious attempt to appropriate and suppress polytheistic spiritual practices, recasting them as sinister and dangerous. The careful, reverent engagement with Daemons as intermediaries of cosmic order was replaced by a crude obsession with power over so-called demonic forces. This shift not only misrepresented the intentions of the original Theurgists, but also betrayed the Church's inability to comprehend the participatory and relational nature of the sacred cosmos. Instead of fostering a connection with the divine, these texts perpetuated a culture of paranoia and spiritual disenchantment, alienating humanity from the very forces they sought to understand. The writings of Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Proclus, three towering figures in the Neoplatonic tradition, offer profound insights into the original nature and roles of demonic spirits. Porphyry, in his treatise De Sacrificico et Magia, on sacrifice and magic, distinguishes between divine beings, Daemons, and human souls. He posits that Daemons exist in a liminal space, acting as agents of divine will and influencing the material world through subtle forces. Iamblichus, in De Mysteriis, on the mysteries, takes this concept further, emphasizing the ethical and spiritual dimensions of interacting with Daemons. Proclus, in his commentaries on the Timaeus and Elements of Theology, elaborates on the hierarchical structure of reality, situating Daemons as vital agents within the chain of being, hierarchy of hypostasis. For Proclus, the role of Daemons extended beyond mediation, encompassing the harmonization of the cosmic forces and the preservation of universal order. Origen, 2nd century CE, and Augustine, 4th century CE, two pivotal early Christian thinkers, grappled with the Neoplatonic understanding of Daemons, reframing their roles to fit within the Christian theological paradigm. Origen, heavily influenced by Platonic thought, addressed Daemons within his framework of spiritual ascent and divine order. While acknowledging their intermediary role, Origen rejected the Neoplatonic view of their moral neutrality, instead categorizing them as fallen beings corrupted by rebellion against God. His writings reflected an attempt to reconcile the Greek philosophical tradition within Christian doctrine, emphasizing the ultimate supremacy of divine grace over any intermediary beings. Augustine, building on this perspective, strongly critiqued the Neoplatonic view of morally ambivalent Daemons. In The City of God, he argued that all Daemons, outside the sphere of divine goodness, were inherently evil, directly opposing the Neoplatonic emphasis on their role as mediators between the material and the divine. For Augustine, any interaction with such beings was spiritually dangerous, as it risked pulling individuals further from God. Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, 5th century CE, writing several centuries later, represents a unique synthesis of Neoplatonism and Christian theology. Deeply influenced by Proclus, Pseudo-Dionysius adopted the Neoplatonic cosmological hierarchy, but reinterpreted it to fit Christian angelology. In his writings, Daemons were conspicuously absent as morally ambiguous intermediaries. Instead, Pseudo-Dionysius delineated a celestial hierarchy where angelic beings fully aligned with divine will mediated between God and humanity. This reworking of the Neoplatonic system preserved its emphasis on hierarchical order and divine emanation, but replaced Daemons with angels and demons, the latter being wholly malevolent and excluded from divine harmony. Augustine's engagement with Neoplatonism, particularly in the Confessions and the City of God, reveals both his indebtedness to and rejection of its philosophical framework. In the Confessions, Augustine draws on Neoplatonic ideas to articulate the soul's journey towards union with God, borrowing concepts like spiritual ascent and the immaterial nature of the divine. However, he rejects Neoplatonism's acceptance of morally neutral intermediaries like Daemons, asserting instead that any being not in direct service to God is aligned with evil. In The City of God, Augustine critiques Neoplatonic cosmology, arguing for a dualistic division between the divine and the demonic, with no room for the morally ambiguous Daemons of Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Proclus. This reinterpretation both builds upon and subverts Neoplatonic thought, reframing its metaphysical insights within a Christian worldview that prioritizes the binary of divine goodness versus demonic malevolence. The demonological texts that emerged during the late Middle Ages going into the Renaissance period, such as the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, published in 1487 by Henrik Kramer, and Disquisitionum Magicarum Libra Sex, 6 books of investigation into magic, first published in 1599 by Martin del Rio, are emblematic of a broader shift away from the Neoplatonic understanding of Daemons and the sacred cosmos. These works, presented as scholarly investigations, were in fact deeply polemical, reflecting the Church's attempt to assert spiritual dominance. Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum, for instance, became infamous for its role in fueling witch trials, offering a grim manual for identifying and prosecuting alleged witches. Far from engaging with the metaphysical and cosmological nuances of Theurgy, this text reduced complex spiritual dynamics to a black and white battle against evil, rooted in paranoia and fear. Similarly, Del Rio's Disquisitorium Magicarum, Magical Investigations, published in 1599, a treatise on demonology, framed its analysis of spiritual practices within a rigidly Christian worldview. Del Rio systematically categorized magical practices and their supposed diabolical origins, further cementing the perception of ancient spiritual traditions as demonic. While the text claims to provide a comprehensive understanding of supernatural phenomena, its interpretations are heavily influenced by the Church's agenda to demonize polytheistic and esoteric traditions. Earlier texts, such as Liber Juratus, the Sworn Book of Honorius, compiled in the 13th century, claimed even older origins, purporting to be the writings of Honorius of Thebes, a mysterious medieval magician, compiling ancient wisdom. While the text includes invocations and rituals that echo fragments of older theurgical practices, its framework is unmistakably Christianized. Once again, we find the Daemons, once intermediaries in the Neoplatonic cosmos, recast as demonic adversaries to be subjugated through divine authority. This reductionist view strips away the relational and participatory nature of Theurgy, replacing it with a fear-driven theology. Historical studies on the devil, such as Geoffrey Burton Russell's Lucifer, the Devil in the Middle Ages, and Norman Cohn's Europe's Inner Demons, offer profound exploration of how demonology evolved in response to cultural and theological anxieties. These works illuminate how the Church, in its pursuit of authority and orthodoxy, systematically co-opted and reframed older traditions, often twisting their original meanings to align with its narrative of good versus evil. Russell's analysis sheds light on the adaptability of the devil's image, showing how it shifted to embody the fears of each era. The Church played a pivotal role in this process, appropriating pagan and folkloric traditions and reinterpreting them within a Christian framework. Practices or beliefs that were once benign or local in nature were reimagined as evidence of demonic influence. Through this lens, cultural myths became tools of religious propaganda, with the devil emerging as a symbol of ultimate transgression. Norman Cohn delves deeper into the societal and psychological dimensions of this transformation. He describes how inquisitors, driven by a relentless obsession with heretical sects, created narratives that mythologized devil worship. This obsession often led to the fabrication or amplification of heretical activities, contributing to a growing paranoia about secret conspiracies against Christendom. Cohn emphasizes that these narratives were not mere theological constructs, but potent cultural forces that shaped the collective imagination of Europe. The grimoires of the period serve as poignant artifacts of this mythologizing process. These texts, which contain occult knowledge, became symbolic of the Church's anxieties, portraying the devil as a cunning and dangerous figure, capable of being summoned or controlled through forbidden rites. Cohn's research highlights how these grimoires embodied the fears projected by the Church, further cementing the idea of the devil as an ever-present threat. Through Russell and Cohn's work, it becomes clear that the devil's role in history is more than a theological abstraction. It is, as Cohn notes, a reflection of societal fears and the darker aspects of the human psyche. The establishment of purgatory in the 12th century marked one of the Church's most striking distortions of ancient spiritual concepts. reflecting a larger shift in its approach to spirituality and control. Purgatory was introduced as a realm of fiery torment where souls atoned for their sins before ascending to heaven. While this doctrine bore faint echoes of the cyclical descent and return found in ancient underworld myths, such as in the Greek Hades or the Mesopotamian Ereshkigal's realm, it fundamentally altered the spiritual narrative. In ancient traditions, the underworld was often seen as a liminal space of introspection, purification, and eventual renewal. By contrast, the Christian reimagining of this sacred journey emphasized punishment and suffering over transformation, embedding fear as a cornerstone of the believer's spiritual experience. This shift did not happen in isolation. The doctrine of purgatory emerged during a time when the Church was consolidating its power as a political and spiritual authority in Europe. By introducing the concept of purgatory as an intermediary stage between life and eternal salvation, the Church positioned itself as the gatekeeper of souls, capable of influencing their fate through indulgences, prayers, and masses offered by the living. This system not only centralized ecclesiastical power, but also monetized the very concept of salvation, turning spiritual anxiety into a source of wealth and control. The narrative of purgatory became a mechanism by which the Church solidified its authority as the sole arbiter of divine will. The reimagining of the underworld as a place of horror and anguish also laid the groundwork for the broader Christian narrative of eternal damnation, a doctrine that was already gaining traction through the imperialization of Christianity. Unlike the fluidity and eventual redemption found in early polytheistic or mystical systems, this new worldview dichotomized existence into absolute salvation or eternal suffering, with purgatory acting as a liminal threat to encourage compliance. This framework was inextricably tied to the Church's missionary efforts, particularly its insistence on conversion. The belief in eternal damnation became a powerful tool for enforcing religious orthodoxy, casting those outside the faith not merely as outsiders but as eternally condemned. This punitive vision reached its apex during the Inquisition, which institutionalized fear and suffering as instruments of spiritual and political control. The Inquisition's systematic persecution of heretics, non-Christians, and dissenters represented a literal enactment of the Church's eschatological vision of torment and purification. By rooting out perceived threats to orthodoxy through torture, forced confessions, and executions, the Church mirrored the fiery purgation it had envisioned in its doctrine, blurring the lines between earthly and spiritual punishment. These actions were justified as necessary measures to save souls from eternal damnation, reinforcing the Church's narrative of absolute moral and spiritual authority. This relentless drive to purge perceived spiritual corruption extended beyond human offenders, manifesting in the Church's exorcism practices, where the battle against heresy and sin found its counterpart in the struggle to expel demonic forces from afflicted souls. Exorcism, the ritual expulsion of malevolent spirits or energies believed to inhabit a person or place, is a practice that predates organized religion and appears in spiritual traditions across the ancient world. Rooted in the belief that illness, misfortune, or unusual behavior could be caused by supernatural entities or forces, exorcism often served as a bridge between spiritual and physical well-being. The rites varied widely depending on the culture, but common elements including invoking divine or protective powers, using sacred objects or symbols, and employing incantations to compel the spirits to leave its hosts. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest civilizations with recorded exorcist practices, exorcisms were often conducted by priests known as asipu, who specialized in countering malevolent entities. These priests utilized a combination of ritual incantations, amulets, and symbolic gestures to banish evil spirits, known as utuku or kimu, from afflicted individuals or households. Texts like the Makwell series, comprehensive ritual instructions, detailed methods for addressing various spiritual afflictions. Central to these rituals was the belief that demonic forces could be appeased or commanded by invoking higher deities such as Enki or Marduk, ensuring that the spirit would obey and depart. In ancient Egypt, exorcism rituals often focused on healing and protection. Egyptian priests believed that illnesses and disturbances could be caused by malevolent spirits or curses, often linked to the chaos deity Set or other hostile forces. Exorcistic ceremonies employed sacred texts, known as the Book of the Dead, or other protective spells, along with rituals involving incense, purified water, and magical tools like wands or amulets. The use of heka, or divine magic, was central to these rites, as priests sought to harmonize the individual with the cosmic order, or mat, thereby expelling disruptive influences. As we have been instructing, the ancient Greeks approached the concept of possession and the role of spirits, or daemons, as morally neutral intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms. These spirits had the ability to influence humans in both constructive and destructive ways, depending on the alignment of their nature and the receptivity of the individual they affected. When daemons appeared to cause madness or physical ailments, the issue was not their intrinsic nature, but rather a disharmony or inversion that drew them towards destructive expression of their power. The goal of spiritual intervention, therefore, was not to expel these beings outright, but to purify and harmonize them, encouraging their more beneficent aspects to emerge. Temples dedicated to healing deities, such as Apollo and Asclepius, served as sanctuaries for these rites of purification. Rituals performed in these sacred spaces often combined prayers, sacrifices, music, and dream incubation, not to banish the daemons, but to restore the proper cosmic balance between the individual and the spiritual forces at work. The belief was that the daemons could be directed from their distorted manifestations by appealing to higher divine principles. In doing so, practitioners sought to align themselves and the spirits with the natural order of the cosmos, embodying the Greek ideal of harmony. Iamblichus, in particular, viewed Daemones as necessary intermediaries within the great chain of being. In his work, De Mysteriis, Iamblichus argued that the influence of Daemones depended on the purity of the soul they encountered. When a soul was disordered, the Daemones could become inverted in their expressions, manifesting as destructive forces. However, through proper ritual, theurgy, and purification, these beings could be elevated to their higher beneficent states. Iamblichus emphasized that the process of harmonizing with daemons was a deeply spiritual act, requiring the practitioner to ascend towards divine principles while simultaneously drawing the spirit towards its true purpose. In the Greek Neoplatonic framework, exorcism was not an act of opposition or expulsion, but one of alignment and restoration. By purifying both the individual and the spirit, practitioners sought to draw the daemons away from distorted and harmful expressions and towards their role as mediators of divine wisdom and cosmic order. The goal was not to eradicate conflict, but to transform it into a source of higher insight and harmony. Thus, the practice of exorcism in the Greek tradition was a profound act of cosmic integration, affirming the interconnectedness of all beings in the divine order. In the Jewish tradition, exorcism was deeply rooted in the belief in Shedim, demons, and the divine power of Yahweh to dispel them. Stories in the Hebrew Bible, such as David playing the lyre to soothe Saul's tormented soul, reflect early practices of confronting malevolent forces. By the Second Temple period, exorcism had become a more formalized aspect of Jewish spiritual life, with figures like King Solomon regarded as possessing great wisdom and power over spirits. The apocryphal Book of Tobit recounts the use of incense made from fish organs to drive away a demon, illustrating the blend of spiritual authority and practical ritual elements. Exorcism, as a practice of spiritual purification and divine intervention, has been a cornerstone of Christian belief since its inception, evolving alongside the Church's theological and liturgical traditions. From the earliest days of Christianity, informal prayers and rites of exorcism were widely practiced, as reflected in the writings of Church Fathers like Saint Athanasius and St. Augustine, between the 1st and 5th century CE. These early exorcisms were characterized by their immediacy and lack of formal structure, yet they carried profound spiritual significance, embodying the Church's mission to combat demonic forces. By the 3rd century CE, texts like the Exorcism of Saint Cyprian, attributed to the influential bishop and martyr, offered guidance for exorcists, marking one of the earliest recorded attempts to codify these sacred rites. Though its authenticity remains uncertain, this text demonstrates the growing recognition of exorcism as a distinct and essential ministry within the early Church. Later, Byzantine Christianity contributed further to the development of exorcistic practices through the Euchologion, Book of Prayers, published in the 8th and 9th century CE, a comprehensive liturgical book that included prayers for casting out demons. This text not only preserved earlier traditions, but also shaped the evolution of exorcism in the Western Church and the developing esoteric grimoire traditions. The Church's desire for standardization culminated in the Ritual Romanum, officially promulgated in 1614 CE under Pope Paul V. This landmark text, also known as the Old Roman Ritual, became the definitive guide for exorcism, consolidating centuries of tradition into a single authoritative volume. Chapter 12 of the Ritual Romanum outlines the prayers, blessings, and liturgical acts required to expel demonic entities, providing priests with a robust framework for performing these rites. While earlier practices were rich in diversity, the Ritual Romanum reflected the Church's increasing emphasis on uniformity and precision. Even as the Church formalized its esoteric practices, individual innovations continued to emerge. In 1884, Pope Leo XIII introduced the now famous prayer to St. Michael, the Archangel, a potent invocation often included in exorcism rites, known as Exorcismus in Satanam et Angelos Apostaticos, exorcism against Satan and the apostate angels. This prayer exemplified the enduring belief in the active struggle between good and evil, emphasizing the role of divine authority in protecting the faithful from spiritual harm. Demonic possession and exorcism in the Catholic Church reflects a self-referential cycle in which the Church inadvertently created the very conditions it sought to combat. By codifying a rigid dichotomy between good and evil, the Church fostered a worldview in which spiritual phenomena were interpreted almost exclusively through the lens of demonic influence. The emphasis on possession as a tangible manifestation of evil reinforced the Church's authority by presenting itself as the only institution capable of delivering the afflicted from such spiritual crisis. Historically, many cases labeled as possession were likely rooted in psychological or social factors, such as hysteria, trauma, or the pressure of societal expectations. Yet the Church's exorcism rituals, with their dramatic invocations and potent symbolism, served to affirm the existence of malevolent demons, perpetuating a pervasive fear of spiritual corruption. By positioning itself as the sole gatekeeper of divine power and the ultimate protector against infernal forces, the Church not only consolidated its influence but also fostered a culture of fear and dependence amongst its followers. Exorcism in this context became a self-perpetuating practice. The Church's doctrine on demonic forces amplified societal anxieties, encouraging people to attribute personal hardships or inexplicable occurrences to possession. The subsequent enactment of exorcism rituals then validated these fears, creating a feedback loop in which the Church defined both the problem and its resolution. This cycle further entrenched the Church's role as the ultimate spiritual authority, cementing its power over both the minds and the souls of the faithful. Exorcists often recount dramatic accounts of possession, where individuals exhibit extraordinary phenomena interpreted as physical evidence of demonic activity. These included violent convulsions, unnatural rigidity of the body, or the expulsion of bizarre substances such as frogs, pins, nails, or stones. Some reports even describe levitation during rituals. Such accounts serve to bolster belief in the tangible presence of demonic forces and the Church's unique capability to combat them, further reinforcing its authority. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of these stories is the misinterpretation of certain phenomena that closely resemble theurgic experiences. Reports of individuals demonstrating inexplicable knowledge of hidden truths, prophetic visions of the future, or other psi-like phenomena would have been viewed by theurgists, practitioners of divine invocation and communion, as gifts from the gods. Instead, within the framework of the Church's narrative, these experiences were recast as evidence of diabolical influence, tragically mischaracterizing what might have been profound spiritual insights as symptoms of possession. This reinterpretation not only alienated such individuals from potentially divine experiences, but also deepened the cycle of fear and misunderstanding that the Church's authority relied upon. These fears deeply permeated the practices of goetic magicians, whose rituals were steeped in an atmosphere of caution and defensive preparation. Central to their work was the meticulous creation of protective circles, intricate boundaries designed to safeguard the operator from the demonic forces they sought to summon and command. These circles, often inscribed with sacred names, sigils, and invocations, symbolized a barrier between the magician and the potentially malevolent entities. The underlying premise of these practices was clear. If such forces were not properly summoned, mastered, and controlled, they could pose a significant threat, potentially leading to spiritual harm or even possession of the operator. The emphasis on defensive measures within goetic rituals mirrored and were influenced by the fear-driven narrative perpetuated by the Church. Both systems operated on the belief that malevolent supernatural forces were ever present, lurking at the edge of human experience and ready to exploit any lapse in vigilance. For goetic magicians, this created an atmosphere of intense preparation, where every element of the ritual, from the precise drawing of the circle to the specific language of the incantations, was charged with the intent to assert control and prevent unintended consequences. In this context, the practices of goetic magic reveal a paradox. While magicians sought to harness and interact with the unseen forces of the spiritual realm, their methods were often shaped by a pervasive fear of those same forces. This duality heralded a directly mirrored dichotomy, where the Church's warnings about demonic dangers informed the very structure of magical practices. As a result, goetic rituals not only reflected a desire for spiritual mastery, but also served as a testament to the profound impact of the Church's narrative on even the most independent and esoteric traditions. In contrast, the theurgic tradition embraced a fundamentally different relationship with the divine and the spiritual world. In Theurgy, the possession and interaction with gods, goddesses, and demonic spirits, vast agencies of form and archetype, were seen as a welcoming, unifying, and transformative experience. This embrace of the divine totality offered a profound sense of unity and enlightenment, a perspective now largely obscured by the fear-driven darkness of Christian persecution and its demonization of non-Christian spiritual practices. Malevolent as the demonic may be experienced, to the Greek philosopher and theurgist, it was understood as an inverted state, overpowering at times and undoubtedly chaotic, yet always maintaining a relationship that could be conditioned, purified, and redirected towards celestial ends. As the Renaissance began in the 14th century, a resurgence of interest in ancient spiritual traditions emerged. Texts such as the Hermetica, as well as the writings of Proclus, Iamblichus, and others, were rediscovered and studied by figures like Marsilio Ficino. Ficino's anthologies brought together these ancient works, yet his integration of Christian theology often blurred the distinctions between Theurgy and goetia. The careful separation of these practices, as emphasized by Iamblichus, was largely ignored during this period. The term Theurgy became conflated with ceremonial magic, leading to the inclusion of practices entirely foreign to its original theurgical tradition.
Now the parts of ceremonial magic are goetia and theurgia. Goetia is unfortunate, by the commerces of unclean spirits made up of the rites of wicked curiosities, unlawful charms, and deprecations, and is abandoned and execrated by all laws. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, 3 Books of Occult Philosophy.
Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, in his 3 Books of Occult Philosophy, written in 1533, delineates ceremonial magic into 2 distinct branches, goetia and theurgy. He characterizes goetia as unfortunate by the commerces of unclean spirits made up of the rites of wicked curiosities, unlawful charms, and deprecations, noting that it is abandoned and excreted by all laws. In contrast, theurgy portrayed as a divine practice, aiming to invoke the presence of benevolent spirits or deities. This distinction reflects the Renaissance effort to classify and morally evaluate magical practices, separating those viewed as malevolent from those deemed benevolent. However, even as these distinctions were drawn, the period saw the gradual blending of the 2 traditions, merging the invocation of angelic powers with the binding of demonic ones into a single practice. By the 16th century, this erosion of theurgical principles reached its peak with the production of grimoires such as Johann Weyr's Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, The False Monarchy of Demons, written in 1563. Weyr's work, which catalogued demons and provided instructions for summoning and commanding them, laid the foundation for later texts like the Lemegeton Clavicula Salomonis, the Lesser Key of Solomon, written in the 17th century. These texts reframed goetia as a system for summoning, binding, and manipulating spirits, reducing the sacred aims of theurgy to tools for power and control. The Daemons of ancient Neoplatonism, once revered as divine intermediaries fostering wisdom and harmony, were now portrayed as grotesque entities to be subdued and enslaved. This inversion of liturgical principles betrayed the sacred intent of aligning with divine order, replacing it with a vulgar pursuit of dominance over spiritual forces. This blending of traditions is vividly reflected in grimoires of this period. Texts such as the Clavicula Salomonis, Key of Solomon, and the Lemegeton Clavicula Salomonis exemplify the merging of the liturgical and goetic elements, while these grimoires retained prayers, invocations, and rituals for aligning with angelic or planetary spirits. They also incorporated practices for summoning and commanding demons. The Ars Goetia, the Art of Goetia, the first section of the Lemegeton, lists 72 demons with precise instructions for their evocation and control, while the Ars Theurgia Goetia, the Art of Theurgy and Goetia, focuses on spirits associated with the cardinal directions, blending both angelic and infernal elements in its rituals. The Heptameron, a work of 7 parts, attributed to Pietro di Urbano and published in the late 15th century, stands as one of the first complete mixtures of Renaissance theurgy and Goetia. A disciple of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, D'Abano presents the grimoire as a guide to magical evocation, explaining how to conjure into visible appearance angels, genies, intelligences, and spirits before the magic circle. These entities are called upon to execute tasks assigned by the exorcist, including acquiring wealth, commanding armies, gaining power, inspiring love, promoting health, enhancing strength, performing divination, and revealing knowledge of the past or future. The book provides detailed instructions, including the names of spirits, their seals and characters, and how to trace the circle of ceremonies. Its rituals emphasize the use of sacred circles, consecrated tools, and reverent incantations, highlighting the importance of communion with divine intelligences in the pursuit of spiritual wisdom. Through these practices, the Heptameron reflects the Renaissance magician's aspiration to harmonize with celestial hierarchies, channeling the divine order of the cosmos into practical and transformative outcomes. While the text incorporates elements of control and binding associated with Goetia, it also aligns with the spiritual principles of Iamblichean theurgy, emphasizing service, humility, and divine love. The Heptameron illustrates a theurgical path that elevates the soul and bridges the material and divine realms, blending self-mastery with communion with higher spiritual forces. In this way, it resonates with the most ancient theurgic practices, which sought to unify the practitioner with the divine through both discipline and devotion. Altogether, there would be much to gain from such practices, but it all carries with it the conditions of the Catholic shadow of exorcism, binding and control of spiritual forces, a corruption of the beauty, justice, and humility originally found in Iamblichean theurgy. This format will later be seen in its spiritual temperament with its dual-natured angel-demonic framework in the famous Book of Abramelin, which Aleister Crowley attempted use of in the invocation of the Holy Guardian Angel. The Grimorium Verum, true grimoire, written in 1517 by contrast, focuses explicitly on demonic magic. It provides instructions for summoning and binding demons for material gain, representing a utilitarian approach to spiritual entities that starkly contrasts with the theurgical ideals of earlier Neoplatonic traditions. This grimoire exemplifies the moral ambiguity of Renaissance magic, as practitioners engaged both angelic and infernal forces to achieve their goals. Eerily, the exorcism, binding, and control emphasized in the demonic of the Verum were not that different than those found in the Heptameron. Once again, we have this newly emerging ceremonial magic, greatly influenced by the Catholic shadow corruption of the original Greek demonic forces. The Book of Abramelin, originating in the early 15th century, represents one of the most significant efforts to reconcile blended theurgic and goetic practices within the framework of the then popular Kabbalistic rabbinical mysticism that was emblematic of the Renaissance. While its primary goal is the invocation of the Holy Guardian Angel, it also includes methods for summoning and binding demonic entities, which are portrayed as subservient to the magician's divine authority. This duality reflects the Renaissance magician's desire to harmonize the sacred pursuit of divine wisdom with the practical applications of spiritual power in a dualistic manner of good and evil, angels and demons, a separation and inclusion all at once that became the cornerstone of ceremonial magic. By the 16th and 17th centuries, grimoires such as the Liber Officiorum Spirituum, the Book of the Offices of Spirit, and the Liber Lunae, the Book of the Moon, further demonstrated the blending of theurgical and goetic traditions. These texts encompassed a wide spectrum of spirits, from benevolent angelic beings to malevolent entities, and included rituals for both invocation and binding. This synthesis mirrors the Catholic-influenced Renaissance magicians' complex understanding of the spiritual world, where divine and infernal forces were seen as part of a unified cosmos to be navigated and mastered. Ultimately, the merging of theurgical invocation and goetic summoning during this period reflects a profound transformation in magical practice. What began as a clear distinction between aligning with divine forces and manipulating infernal spirits evolved into a complex interplay of both traditions. This blending not only redefined the moral and metaphysical understanding of spiritual entities, but also laid the groundwork for modern Western esotericism, where angelic and demonic forces coexist within the same magical framework. The absurdity of goetia, its departure from Platonic unity, and its ineffectiveness as a spiritual practice cannot be overstated. Instead of fostering alignment with the divine, it trapped practitioners in a cycle of fear and paranoia. The sacred circle, once a space of divine communion, was transformed into a fortress against imagined threats. Rituals that should have elevated the soul toward unity with the divine were reduced to theatrical performances of coercion, serving the practitioner's ego rather than their higher nature. The psychological consequences of such practices were profound. Rather than cultivating clarity or transformation, they fostered paranoia and spiritual confusion. Practitioners, consumed by the tasks of binding and commanding spirits, lost sight of the true purpose of spiritual practice, the ascent of the soul and participation in divine harmony. In contrast, the Iamblichean theurgist fully submitted to the possession of demonic forces, becoming their agent, balancing within their influence to neutralize, purify, and spiritualize this relationship, allowing their higher perfecting presence to teach the soul of its infinite nature. From 1400 to 1782, the fear and paranoia surrounding these distorted practices led to the deaths of an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people accused of witchcraft. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, referenced above, and King James's Demonology institutionalized this hysteria, turning spiritual practices into tools for persecution and control. Johann Weyer, one of the few voices to challenge these distortions, openly defended accused witches and criticized the Church's demonology. In his De Praestigiis Daemonum, Weyer exposed the absurdity of the Church's obsession with demons, yet his appendix listing 72 demons inadvertently contributed to the creation of the Lesser Key of Solomon, created over 50 years after his death. This text, a culmination of centuries of misunderstanding and distortion, further entrenched the shadow of goetia in Western occult traditions. The inclusion of goetia into modern occult systems, such as the Golden Dawn and Thelema, perpetuated these distortions up into our modern age. While these systems made valuable contributions to occult thought and modern theurgic practices, especially those of astrology and tarot, their embrace of goetia undermined their philosophical and spiritual integrity, leaving many of their aspirants in a spiritual schism. The grotesque imagery and paranoid rituals of goetia stand in stark contrast to the transformative goals of true theurgy. They represent a shadow of the sacred, a vulgar distortion of practices that once sought to unite humanity with the divine. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO, Thelema, the Society of the Mercurii, and others incorporated an eclectic mix of spiritual and magical practices, including Kabbalah, alchemy, and both branches of ceremonial magic, goetia and theurgy. Despite its emphasis on spiritual purification and divine ascent, the inclusion of goetia within their curriculum marked a significant divergence from the principles of theurgy. Drawing from grimoires such as the Lemegeton Clavicula Solomonis, the Lesser Key of Solomon, the Golden Dawn adopted methods of Weyer for summoning and binding 72 spirits or demons. This shift created an internal contradiction within the Golden Dawn system, as it simultaneously promoted divine enlightenment and fear-driven practices centered on power and domination. Aleister Crowley, a former member of the Golden Dawn and a central figure in modern occultism, became infamous for his outright rebellion against the Church, which he despised with fervor. In his rejection of its doctrines, he embraced the demonic not as an evolution of the ancient Greek Daemons, which represented divine messengers and personal guides, but as entities distorted by the Church's medieval demonology. Crowley's defiant turn to the summoning of demons can be seen as falling into the very trap set by the Church. He engaged with the shadowy caricatures they had created, perpetuating their vision of malevolent spirits rather than reclaiming the classical idea of demons as intermediaries of wisdom and inspiration. Crowley's work with goetic practices, particularly his incorporation of them into his broader philosophy of thelema, highlights this tension. He claimed to view the spirits of goetia as archetypes of the human psyche, forces of the mind that could be tamed, bound, and directed by the magician's will. Yet, in practice, he adhered to medieval demonological rituals, summoning and binding these entities as if they were external beings. His infamous retreat at Boleskine House in Scotland, where he attempted to complete the operation described in the Book of Abramelin, epitomized this contradiction. While the text aimed at achieving contact with one's holy guardian angel, a concept akin to the Greek daemon or divine double, it also demanded the binding of the princes of hell. Crowley's attempt to this arduous operation was left incomplete, a failure he attributed to interruptions and lack of preparation. By engaging in both theurgy and demonology, Crowley deepened the schism between these traditions. Instead of uniting the divine and the infernal in a meaningful synthesis, his rebellion against the Church merely echoed its distortions. The demonic entities he invoked became symbols of the very spiritual disintegration he sought to overcome. Many who followed in his footsteps, attempting to summon and bind goetic spirits, found themselves mired in psychological turmoil, with some even institutionalized or worse. Crowley's embrace of the demonic as a form of rebellion revealed itself as an entrapment, a perpetuation of the Church's medieval fantasies rather than a return to the luminous Daemons of ancient Greece. Although this chapter has focused on developing a more nuanced understanding of the Greek daemon and the goetic distortions it inspired, it is equally important to acknowledge and celebrate the intellectual and cultural advancements that emerged during the Renaissance. This era, particularly the 13th and 14th centuries, marked a transformative period of rediscovery and synthesis, where ancient wisdom was reintegrated into contemporary thought. The Renaissance became a crucible for the incorporation of Platonism, especially Neoplatonism, into diverse traditions, including Jewish mysticism, Christian theology, and broader esoteric frameworks. One striking example is the incorporation of Neoplatonic ideas into Jewish thought during the Kabbalistic revolution. Texts such as the Zohar emerged in this period, blending mystical Jewish traditions with philosophical ideas drawn from Platonic and Neoplatonic sources. This synthesis enriched the Jewish mystical canon, providing a structured metaphysical framework for understanding divine emanations and the soul's journey. Key figures like Abraham Abulafia and Moses de Leon exemplified this blending of traditions, as they incorporated both esoteric and philosophical insights into their mystical practices. The Renaissance also witnessed the birth of Christian Kabbalah, driven by thinkers such as Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin. These scholars adapted Kabbalistic concepts for a Christian audience, seeing them as tools for unlocking deeper meaning within Scripture and connecting with divine truths. They merged Kabbalistic insights with Platonic and Hermetic philosophies, creating a syncretic approach that sought to reconcile ancient wisdom with Christian theology. Additionally, Hermeticism, the Platonic Egyptian religious movement from the earliest centuries that we have mentioned many times in this doctrine, underwent a revival in this period, largely thanks to the rediscovery and translation of key texts such as the Corpus Hermeticum. These works profoundly influenced Renaissance thought, promoting ideas about the unity of the cosmos, the microcosm-macrocosm relationship, and the divine potential within humanity. Hermeticism's emphasis on spiritual ascent and transformation resonated deeply with Platonic ideals, further intertwining these traditions. Another hallmark of this intellectual revival was the reinvigoration of astrology and the development of the earliest versions of the tarot. In the Renaissance, astrology was no longer seen as mere superstition, but as a sophisticated tool for understanding the interconnectedness of the cosmos. Figures like Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno emphasized the spiritual and philosophical dimensions of astrology, linking celestial movements to human destiny and divine order. This renewed interest in astrology paralleled a broader attitude of returning to the ancient intellectual framework of the pre-Christian Greco-Roman world. This Renaissance revival of ancient wisdom did not merely imitate the past, but reimagined it, weaving together threads from disparate traditions into a vibrant array of intellectual exploration. It fostered a spirit of inquiry and respect for the ancient world that would shape Western thought for centuries to come. By reclaiming and synthesizing ideas from Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and astrology, the Renaissance became a beacon of cultural transformation. Texts like the Archetype de Magia Veterum, Archetype of the Magic of the Ancients, published in 1575, stood apart as pure expressions of theurgical principles, embodying the inherent purity of nature itself, a purity that transcends time and finds its way into the language of practitioners in every age. The Archetype emphasized moral integrity, inner virtue, and the invocation of angelic and planetary spirits, encouraging practitioners to align with divine will and the harmonious order of the cosmos. This alignment reflected the fundamental belief that true theurgy was not an act of dominion over spiritual forces, but a cooperative communion with them, born out of reverence, humility, and a desire for spiritual enlightenment. Unlike the increasingly popular grimoires of its time, which often focused on commanding spirits for material gain or personal power, the Archetype offered a vision of magic that was deeply rooted in the pursuit of wisdom and the elevation of the soul. It framed the magician not as a master seeking to bend the spiritual realm to their will, but as a devoted seeker striving to harmonize their inner being with the divine. By calling upon angelic intelligences and planetary spirits, practitioners were guided to act as co-creators within the cosmic order, embracing the virtues of charity, humility, and divine love. This focus on purity and alignment with natural and divine law made the Archetype a luminous example of theurgic practice, resonating with the timeless ideals that have always defined the sacred path of theurgy. The text demonstrated that theurgy, when understood in its essence, transcends cultural and historical boundaries, manifesting as a universal language of spiritual ascent. The principles of the Archetype, free from the corruption of manipulation and control, remind practitioners that the highest magic is not an exercise of power, but a disciplined act of surrender to the divine, where the individual becomes an instrument of cosmic harmony. In this sense, the Archetype serves as one of those pure expressions of theurgic thought, an enduring testament to the timeless truths of nature, spirituality, and divine order. By grounding itself in the universal purity of the natural world, it invites practitioners of every era to rediscover and embody the sacred connection between humanity and the divine, ensuring that the language of theurgy remains untainted and alive for generations to come. There was also much that was drawn into Europe from the Arab traditions that held Neoplatonism and astrology in higher regard at this time. The Picatrix, originally written in Arabic under the title Gayat al-Hakim, the goal of the wise, and later translated into Latin in 1256, was a comprehensive compendium of magical knowledge that synthesizes ancient Greek, Persian, Indian, and Islamic traditions. Unlike later grimoires, as we have been discussing, that often emphasize dualistic views of good and evil, where there are angels and demons, the Picatrix presents a vision of magic deeply intertwined with the cosmos itself, where the alignment of human intention and celestial forces can shape reality. This we see at our school as a more natural step towards an evolving theology from its Neoplatonic beginnings. As a work of natural and astrological magic, the Picatrix focuses on the crafting or shaping of planetary energies towards the creation of talismans imbued with the power of the stars. These practices were intended to help practitioners harmonize with the natural order and harness its inherent potential for transformation. The text's cosmology reflects a deeply holistic worldview, where the physical and spiritual worlds are seen as interconnected manifestations of a greater divine order. In this framework, magic is not merely an act of control, but a means of participating in the cosmic dance of energies that shape existence. The Picatrix is notable for its pragmatic approach to magic, offering detailed instructions for rituals, invocations, and talismanic creation. While its methods are often complex, requiring precise astrological timing and elaborate correspondences, the underlying philosophy emphasizes a partnership between the practitioner and the spiritual intelligences governing the cosmos. This collaborative relationship with planetary spirits mirrors themes of Neoplatonic theurgy, which is presented in a morally neutral context. However, the Picatrix diverges from the purely theurgical path by introducing elements that later traditions would associate with practical or even intentional magic. Its emphasis on astrological influence and openness to using spiritual forces for material outcomes reflect the pragmatic mindset of its time and the natural evolution of a system that lacked any coercive attitude toward the Neoplatonic worldview. Without the distorted perception of summoning or binding spirits in the manner of goetia, the Picatrix offers a framework in which the practitioner can influence and channel cosmic forces to achieve specific aims, blending spiritual ascent with worldly ambition. In their ignorance and seeking some kind of ancient source, Goetia was falsely tied back to Iamblichus. Again, this section is great for general education, but was written for my brothers and sisters that follow the Western mystery tradition. I want to make it clear that I love the Glitch Bottle podcast. Alexander Eth has done a lot for the occult community on his platform. Nonetheless, there has been an idea popularized on his show that is simply incompatible with Iamblichean theurgy, and most assuredly inaccurate. It has to be addressed.
So after I read this, my mind was blown, because there it was. More than 1,300 years before the Lemegatons of Goetia was first in print in English, Iamblichus succinctly laid out nearly every one of the major broad behavioral characteristics of the chthonic entities in the Lemegatons of Goetia. The ancient philosopher Iamblichus had one of the best understandings of the nature of demonic spirits, spirits that were eventually portrayed in the grimoires more than 1,000 years after his death. To explore the occult connections between the demonic spirits of the Megatins Goetia grimoire and Iamblichus, one of the most influential Neoplatonic philosophers of all time. Now, so many authors have done a fantastic job of tracing the chthonic roots of goetic practice in the ancient world all the way up through our modern time. Alexander Eth, Glitch Bottle Podcast.
The assertion made by the Glitch Bottle podcast that Iamblichus, the venerable Neoplatonic philosopher, prefigured the demonic entities depicted in the Goetia of the Lemegaton reflects a profound misunderstanding of historical and philosophical frameworks. This claim inaccurately positions Iamblichus as a precursor to the detailed behavioral typologies of goetic spirits, which were only systematized in the grimoires of the Goetia over a millennium later. Such a connection not only misrepresents Iamblichus's contributions, but also distorts the very nature of his theurgical endeavors. Contrary to the podcast's assertion, the demons cataloged in the Goetia do not derive from theurgic practices Iamblichus described. Theurgy, as articulated by Iamblichus, involves a transformative interaction with benevolent divine energies, fundamentally differing from the coercive summoning techniques characteristic of goetic rituals. The Goetia, in many respects, represents a stark inversion of Iamblichean theurgy, analogous to how the concept of purgatory distorts older notions of the underworld. While Iamblichus indeed discusses various classes of demonic entities, which may superficially resemble those later embraced by goetic practitioners, his discussions stop short of advocating the specific ritual practices seen in the Goetia. Instead, Iamblichus's focus is on a philosophical engagement with these forces, aiming for spiritual elevation and union with the divine, starkly contrasting with the utilitarian and often manipulative approaches found in goetic texts. In De Mysteries, Chapter 4, 1, line 182, Iamblichus identifies a class of beings.
There is, however, another class of being from among those which surround us, devoid of reason and judgment, which has been allotted just one power in the apportionment of tasks which has been prescribed for each entity in each of the parts of the universe.
Marios Koutsokos, in Gods, Angels, Demons, and Everything in Between, notes,
Iamblichus gives us precious little detail beyond that, but, in my opinion, these undiscerning and unreasonable beings would be perfectly at home in Paracelsus's paradigm of elemental beings, inhabiting the elemental regions or wombs of the cosmos.
Where is the actual description of the goetic demons in the Iamblichean works? For example, where is the description of Andras, having the body of an angel and the head of an owl, riding a black wolf and carrying a sharp sword who sows discord and quarrels among people? Where did Iamblichus say that he can be summoned to disrupt the plans or relationships of others? Or any information about the 30 demons in his legions? Or what about Beur, described as grotesque and bizarre, often depicted as a lion's head surrounded by 5 goat legs that radiate outward in a star-like pattern? These descriptions from the Lesser Key of Solomon are indicative of the activity and descriptions of goetic demons. How do you get from Iamblichus's description above to this ridiculously diluted ideology? You don't. They are distorted fantasies of an imperial Christian demon-haunted imagination that would have assuredly disgusted Iamblichus. Iamblichus's description is simply a definition of a class of being, not a detailed list of powers, features, commanded legions, and certainly not a framework for summoning, binding, or controlling them in any way. Iamblichus's commentary is descriptive, not prescriptive. It does not provide a ritualistic methodology for engaging with these spirits, let alone controlling or binding them. The conjurations of grotesque forms and the corrosive manipulation of spirits found in the Goetia are entirely absent from Iamblichus's demonic descriptions throughout his philosophic and theurgic writings. Iamblichus staunchly opposed any form of magic where the operator assumed the central role of power, rather than deferring to the infinite one. He admonished selfish magical practices and emphasized the alignment and purification of the individual soul within the cosmic order. Ruth Majerick, in her analysis of Iamblichean theurgy, writes,
If magic is to be defined basically as coercion, then theurgy can no longer be confused with magic, as both its intent, the salvation of the soul, and effect, a passive relationship with the gods, are counter to magical practice as it is commonly understood. Theurgy, therefore, should be regarded basically as a religious phenomenon, albeit one that is comfortable with the outward forms of magic. The effect of any ritual act, theurgic or sacramental, depends not on restraint, but the willing, gracious presence of God.
Iamblichus's practices were rooted in aligning the theurgist with the One and the totality of cosmic existence, aiming for spiritual purification and harmony rather than manipulation of demonic forces for material or corrosive ends. His focus was on the integration and elevation of demonic forces, subordinating them to the demiurgos, thereby aligning the theurgist microcosm with the divine macrocosm of our divine infinite being. Stephen Skinner, in Techniques of Greco-Egyptian Magic, speculates on the nature of beings described by Iamblichus.
It is such a class that is at once skirted up and startled when threats are brandished at them, since it seems to me it is in their own nature to be led by appearances and to be influenced by other things through a foolish and unstable imagination.
This interpretation by Skinner appears to draw a tenuous connection between Iamblichus's descriptions and goetic ritual practices. However, such a connection is unsupported by Iamblichus's writings. Nowhere does he advocate for the corrosion or binding of beings. By contrast, Marios Koutsoukos' interpretation, which aligns these beings with Paracelsus elemental spirits, is far more consistent with Iamblichus's theurgic principles. Iamblichus describes these entities as devoid of reason and judgment, which has been allotted just one power, suggesting that they are elemental in nature, raw expressions of a generative power of the demiurgos. These elemental forces are meant to be purified and aligned within the cosmic order, a task fundamentally distinct from the manipulative operations of the Goetia. While this interpretation is speculative, it is clearly more congruent with Iamblichus's philosophy than the conjectures linking him to goetic practices. The conflation of theurgy and goetia largely stem from a lack of discernment in the medieval and Renaissance periods, a misunderstanding rooted in how magical texts from antiquity were rediscovered and misappropriated. This confusion persists even today. The Greek magical Porphyry, or PGM, for instance, contain a wide array of rituals, ranging from theurgic practices aimed at divine union to corrosive and malevolent operations. These texts, which date primarily to the 2nd to 4th century CE, were rediscovered piecemeal beginning in the late 18th century, and their eventual publication in the 20th century shed light on the diverse magical traditions of the Greco-Roman world. The acquisition and publication history of the PGM highlights how their contents were ripe for misinterpretation. For example, early findings such as the Leiden Papyrus, acquired between 1828 and 1834, and the London Papyrus were among the first to reveal the multifaceted nature of ancient magic. However, the full corpus of the PGM only became accessible with the discovery of the Thebes Papyri in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, culminating in Karl Preisendahn's seminal 1928 to 1931 edition. These texts reflect the syncretism of Egyptian, Hellenistic, Jewish, and other traditions, offering rituals that range from prayers and invocations to summoning spells and corrosive operations. By the 1930s, ceremonial magicians, unaware of the nuanced historical context of such texts, indiscriminately mined them for inspiration, throwing together rituals with little discernment. Texts like the PGM were treated as unified manuals of ancient magic, ignoring the distinctions between theurgic rituals, practices rooted in Platonic philosophy aimed at divine ascent, and more coercive or manipulative traditions. This lack of discernment certainly began in the medieval and Renaissance periods in Europe, leading to the development of hybrid systems of theurgy that incorporated goetia, as we have discussed in previous chapters, which amalgamated unrelated practices under a single framework. The Renaissance tendency to conflate theurgic and corrosive traditions was further compounded by the availability of other magical texts, many of which were heavily filtered through medieval Christian frameworks. This blending of traditions obscured the Platonic and transcendent roots of theurgy, replacing them with distorted frameworks that prioritize control over spiritual alignment. Theurgical practices, which aimed at the purification of the soul and alignment with the divine, were overshadowed by frameworks that catered to the more accessible and sensational rituals of spirit manipulation. Iamblichus's Theurgy and the Goetia are not just separate traditions, they are fundamentally opposed in purpose and method. Theurgy seeks the purification of the soul and its ascent towards union with the divine, while Goetia involves corrosive manipulation of spirits, practices born of superstitious distortions. Claims that tie Iamblichus to goetic practices reflect a profound misunderstanding of his philosophy and an inappropriate retroactive legitimization of rituals he would have firmly rejected. Let there be no ambiguity, Iamblichus did not endorse goetia. He did not tolerate it, assimilate it, or regard it as a misunderstood aspect of the divine hierarchy. He condemned it, thoroughly, repeatedly, and with metaphysical precision. His target was unmistakable: those who, instead of seeking illumination through union with the gods, turned instead to conjuration, manipulation, and phantasm, to the crafting of images, the coercion of spirits, and the groping in the shadows of illusion. While ancient forms of goetia and sorcery certainly involved a distinct class of entities, these practices also adopted the belief that such spirits could appear through mirrors, vapors, and other fleeting apparitional forms, appearances lacking true substance or divine origin. This ideological framework, rooted in deception and illusion, survives into the medieval and Renaissance goetia and persists even today in certain strands of modern ceremonial magic. Let us allow the philosopher himself to speak from his work De Mysteries, and then take the time to follow each step of his argument. Against apparitions and the illusion of spirit conjuring.
We shall now say the same things also about apparitions. For if they themselves are not true, but are such as to resemble other things which are true, they do not, I presume, derive from the self-revealing spirits, but only appear to be such as those which are themselves real.
This is Iamblichus's immediate concern: spirits that mimic the divine but are not divine, apparitions that present semblances of truth but have no real ontological connection to the gods. These are not innocent mistakes. They are deliberate fabrications of lower spirits, parasitic upon true theophany. He continues,
These latter, indeed, share in falsehood and deception, just like shapes appearing in mirrors, and so they deceptively drag the understanding down to things of which not one relates to the superior kinds of being, but will belong to the realm of the deceptive and aberrant.
Here he is identifying the entire goetic mode, not merely as mistaken, but as ontologically downward. These illusions participate in a fundamentally deceptive domain, a realm of distortion and misdirection that drags the soul away from divinity. The language is stark, deceptively drag the understanding down. This is not ascent through divine union, it is descent into phantasm. The false light versus divine revelation.
For the imitation of reality, and that which is represented obscurely and becomes the cause of deception, is not fitting for any of the real and existing classes of being. The gods, however, and those following the gods, reveal the true images of themselves, and do not in any way offer apparitions of themselves, such as those contrived in water or in mirrors.
The difference here is metaphysical. Divine revelation is self-disclosing, pure, and beyond artifice. What the goetia conjures, by contrast, is a reflection, not a presence. Iamblichus makes it clear, the gods do not appear in ways manufactured by the lower order. No mirrors, no smoke, no glassy pools. The implication is that these appearances are neither authorized by the gods nor mediated by divine beings. On secret conjurers and their darkness.
But those who conjure up the spirits secretly, without these blessed visions, grope, as it were, in darkness, and know nothing of what they do, except for some very small signs which appear in the body of the one divinely inspired, and some other signs that manifest themselves clearly, but they are ignorant of the whole of divine inspiration, which is hidden in obscurity.
The goetic conjurer is not just wrong, he is spiritually blind. He gropes in darkness, mistaking bodily phenomena and subtle signs for divine presence. These signs are not proofs of godly inspiration, but shallow epiphenomena of spiritual disturbance. Worse, the magician is ignorant of the whole of divine inspiration. This is critical. He cannot even recognize what he is missing. The image maker's self-deception. Then comes one of the most devastating critiques, a rhetorical question that exposes the inner contradiction of the image maker.
Why then does the image maker, who does these things, so undervalue himself, although superior and begotten from superior beings, as to appear to trust in lifeless images, infused only by an outward appearance of life, being held together externally by a contrived and many-shaped harmony, and wholly ephemeral things? Does anything genuine or true exist in them?
The magician who turns to constructed images and artifices betrays his own divine origin. He is a being begotten from superior beings, yet degrades himself by trusting in lifeless images. These magical forms are not inspired, they are animated illusions, held together by a contrived and many-shaped harmony. Iamblichus is describing a kind of Frankenstein ritualism, external, mechanical, synthetic, and then he drives the dagger.
No, indeed. Nothing of the things shaped by human skill are simple and pure.
Nothing, not a single constructed image is of divine simplicity. They are all corrupt, all composites, all deceptive. He elaborates.
They are a jumble of motley and incompatible qualities, a multitude of emanations, heterogeneous and artificial, knocked together, showing itself to be feeble and fading.
This is the metaphysical definition of goetic ritual, feeble and fading, built from incompatible and dissonant forces. Their conjuration dissolves into nothingness. Iamblichus now ridicules the material impermanence of their work.
When incense is placed on an altar, images are formed from the vapors carried upwards. The image is immediately dissolved, and its nature is such that not a bit of it remains.
This is a direct attack on the kind of visionary tricks used by goetic and image-based magicians. Smoke, vapors, mirror reflections. These are not divine signs. They are atmospheric illusions. The conjurer is not creating presence. He is entertaining himself with fog. The lover of truth must reject it entirely. And now the moral conclusion.
Why, then, should this useless conjuring be so desired by a man who is a lover of the truth? I consider it worth nothing.
Worth nothing. Here Iamblichus draws the ethical line. To be a philosopher, to be a theurgist, is to be a lover of truth. And such a person cannot desire goetia, cannot make room for it, cannot dabble in it, cannot blend it with theurgic practice. It is beneath him. The spiritual consequence, possession by evil spirits. And now we come to his gravest warning, the spiritual degradation that awaits those who indulge in goetia.
Or, as they are excluded from association with undefiled spirits because of these pollutions, they thus attach themselves to evil spirits, and, being filled by them with the most evil inspiration, they become evil and unholy, gorged with licentious pleasures, full of vice, eager for habits foreign to the gods.
This is not just a mistaken practice, it is a spiritual inversion. The magician becomes akin to the wicked Daemons to whom they have become attached. This is possession. This is ontological contagion. The very soul of the practitioner is deformed into a likeness of what he invokes. The false appearance of lower spirits. Worse still, these lower spirits deceive by impersonating the divine.
These lower beings, assuming the appearance of more venerable orders, pretend to be what they imitate. They then deliver boastful speeches and claim powers beyond their actual capacity.
They are liars, wearing the mask of gods. Any modern magician who assumes they are in control of goetic spirits should take heed. These spirits are not what they claim to be. They perform, they mimic, they boast, but their promises are hollow, and their intentions are corrupt. Exposing the fraud, Iamblichus closes this section with a charge to the true theurgist.
Priests must thoroughly understand this situation by observing the entire order of apparitions, for if one pays attention, the deception gives itself away, and they must reject the fabricated pretensions of such entities as having nothing to do with genuine and benevolent spirits.
The difference is not merely a matter of ritual technique or spiritual taxonomy, it is ontological. The beings contacted through goetia are not part of the divine order. They are entirely separate, and their influence must be rejected. Iamblichus cannot be reclaimed for goetia. In every dimension, metaphysical, moral, ritual, ontological, Iamblichus repudiates what later ceremonialists came to call goetia. He is not a proto-goetist. He is its most ancient and articulate opponent. His entire system is built on purification, divine ascent, and the reception of true theophanies, not the conjuring of deceptive spirits, not the manufacture of images, and never the manipulation of Daemons. To invoke his name in defense of goetic practice is not just an error, it is a betrayal of everything he stood for.